Hello there. Before I get started in this introduction to the hands, I just want to point out that this is an introductory video, and the lengthier video is coming later this week. This is the largest section in the Bridgman book. In addition, this is the introduction to that section, which I feel is the most important part of the entire chapter of the hands. It's also a look into the way Bridgman actually taught his students. He was teaching not just the anatomy or the rendering of the human form, but why we do this, what the purpose is, and using a little bit of art history to show the cultural differences and the historic differences in the way that the human hand was portrayed throughout time. These first 4 pages are the most important 4 pages within this entire book, in my opinion, because they really show a clear portrayal of Bridgman and the breadth of what he taught. We'll look at some of his students shortly, but I want to make it very clear that he didn't begin this chapter with the construction or the planes or the anatomy, but rather a little bit of art history and some depth and breadth into the human hand as a functional tool, depending upon the class of person or the culture that's depicting them. His drawings and his students' drawings are on these pages as examples, but they're not exemplifying the types of artists that he was describing. I believe that when his students laid out this book, they were just including some visual examples so you don't have 4 pages of writing prior to looking at the art. They sprinkled the art throughout the entire book, so there really isn't any section that's purely words alone. And because they have so many good quality examples from Bridgman and probably the top tier students, that they wanted to make sure they could fit that artwork in throughout the entire book. I encourage you to read these 4 pages before you get started in this section. In fact, I encourage you to read these 4 pages over almost any other pages in the book. You get a really good understanding of what he's trying to pass on to his students. This is around the first time that the human form has been dissected for the sake of learning about the anatomy. Now, there has been studies of the anatomy in the past, but for the most part, it was sort of illegal to do so, both by the church and by law. The human form was not supposed to be cut open and examined in the same way that we do that in this day and age, where we do autopsies and we have art classes going into the morgues and looking at the human form dissected to really understand the structure and the mechanics of the human body through the musculature, tendons, ligaments, and so forth. It wasn't widely accepted back then. Bridgman's book is one of the first that looks underneath the skin to understand the true mechanics of the human body. But again, he's letting his students know first what the importance is of studying the human form by utilizing a whole range of cultures and artists as examples as to how each one of these cultures and individuals painted the hands based upon who they were painting for or what they were painting for. And he starts us off with the ancient Peruvians and the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the way that they depicted the human form based upon the class of person that they were painting, sculpting, building relief, or drawing for. So here we have an example of a Peruvian hand, very decadent in the filigree on this particular sculpture, but also the sturdiness of the fingers without getting caught up in the anatomical details. There's some knobbiness for the knuckles in here, but they're not fully depicted realistically. They're more very functional looking fingers. And then the Egyptian hands, these are hands of royalty. And you can see that these fingers have probably never done a single thing in their entire life that is hard labor intensive. These fingers are long, thin, elegant, very clean, very clear. Of course, these are of royalty. Somebody who didn't toil in the fields or build pyramids or dig ditches or anything where the hands would get bruised and calloused and swollen and hardened from all of that labor and hard work. And then an example of the Assyrian hand. This is just one of many. There's a lot of different ways that the Assyrians depicted the human form in a very designerly fashion. This was one of the more realistic versions that I was able to find as an example on the internet. And you can see again, the knuckles are not well designed or thoughtful anatomically. They're very functional looking. And you can see by the way that they depicted the lower half of the fingers, right? You have the proximal, middle, distal. These are the middle and distal segments of the fingers, and they're all roughly about the same length. They're not making one finger shorter and the other finger longer. They're making this hand very functional looking. And then in the pre-Renaissance, we have Botticelli in the way that he generated hands, very clear and simple, but easy to read since he pushed a lot of symbolism into the gesture of the fingers. And then we have Dürer. Albrecht Dürer was generating hands that are praying, hands that are hammering. Religious hands versus hands of labor, the realism, the vascular, the knuckles, the folds in the skin. He was mapping things out with a bit more realism in them. But he too was pushing symbolism in the hands that he was creating. We have hands from the Gothic period in art, and their sharp and simple depiction, hands that were painted for churches, and all of the different scenarios of the human being. But as you can see with all the smaller images, the shapes had to be simplified in order for things to read very easily. Given also that this image is a little bit on the blurry side, it makes it even harder to see them. But fingers and toes, as you can also see on the bare feet of this monk, were lengthy. They were long and drawn out, very easy to catch the eye of the viewer. And then also depicted either in a functional manner or a symbolic manner, but simplified down and easy to read for those gestures. Then moving forward in art history, we have some of the Renaissance painters. We have Michelangelo and Raphael, two artists of the same period, one who's more designerly, Michelangelo, and one who has a more naturalistic depiction of them, which would be Raphael. And then the curiosity and the sculptural qualities of Leonardo da Vinci's hands. In the way that some of his art shows, he was able to look at the human form under the skin with a lot of the anatomy studies that he had done. And I don't know if that was he was given permission to do those or not. I'm not really clear on that part of it, but he did understand how the human being functioned under the skin, the mechanics of the muscles and the bones. And then he was able to generate a more realism with that knowledge. But also, Leonardo's art was highly symbolic. So he wasn't just drawing things for the sake of the anatomy. He was drawing things for the sake of the story. We have teacher and student, Peter Paul Rubens, the teacher, and Van Dyck, one of his apprentices or student. Peter Paul Rubens was one of those artists that could paint a wide variety and range of types. He painted historical paintings, religious paintings, portraits, commissions. He kind of did it all. And he portrayed all different walks of life in all of the paintings that he did. And he had a pretty good understanding of how the human form looked and felt. Passing that knowledge on to Van Dyck, Van Dyck's clientele were the wealthy class. And the hands that he portrayed were not rugged at all. They were very decadent, very clean and clear. People who had wealth didn't do the hard labor, and it shows in a lot of the paintings that he did. He came from Rubens as a student, but he went on to paint a certain class of people, and as a result, his art was fashioned towards that class. And then we have the standalone Rembrandt, who painted things with a physical realism to them. He painted all of the textures to feel the texture that they were. We could feel the leatheriness of these hands versus the softness of the material on the sleeves and on the cuffs, the hardness and the shininess of the cane that he's holding in his hand, the varnished feeling of the surface, or the well-worn surface that was held in these hands for many, many years, making the wood feel very lacquered and shiny as a result. There's a difference in all of these textures. You can feel the skin hanging off of the bones and the muscles of the hands in any of his paintings. This one is a fairly good example of the vascular and the tendinous masses underneath the dorsal side of the hands, the ruggedness of the knuckles, and the ruddiness versus the cool colors of the vascular passing under the skin. You could see it, you could feel it within the way that he portrayed things. He was very much a realist in terms of making things feel exactly the way he saw them and capturing that realism through the color usage and the textural quality that he was able to push the paint into. Now, speeding up a little bit farther, we have an example here of the golden age of illustration, and that's Harvey Dunn. Harvey Dunn painted the rugged man, the man of the prairie, the warrior class, and the hard laborer, the worker, the farmer, hands that were used as tools, as you can see here with these hands. Very rugged, kind of dirty or soiled. You wouldn't want to get hit with that fist that's holding the hammer. That thing looks like a brick, and it feels like it could really do some damage. And then the other hand, the fingers are a little bit gnarled, they're a little bit dirty, but that hand is a huge hand that's able to hold things, hammer things, dig things, and so forth. And unfortunately, her hands are not visible, but he was able to portray the difference between the genders, yet he painted the working person, so even the female hands that he painted had a certain ruggedness to them, of a strong functionality of those hands based upon the work these people did on a day-to-day basis to survive and to make it through whatever it was that they were striving for in life. And then from all of that, we have Dean Cornwell, who was called the Dean of Illustrators and considered one of the greatest composers of all time. He was a designer through and through, regardless of the period of his life that he was painting in. And he had 4 major periods of art that he created. His drawings were like this throughout his entire career. Very structural, very well designed, very stylized towards that kind of construction, regardless of the type of brushstroke that he used when he painted the pictures that he painted. And then 2 really great examples of Bridgman's students. We first have Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell took Bridgman's words to heart. He really pushed a variety of hands based upon the type of person that he was painting. You could sort of consider Norman Rockwell like a method actor as an illustrator. He was able to get into the type of person he was painting and paint them thoroughly the way that they're depicted in society, whether it was elegant hands, or the hands of an artist, or the hands of a serviceman, or a leader, a model, a child, an elderly person. He was able to portray hands in a wide variety, and he did a lot of research before each of his paintings to find artists who painted the type of person that he was about to paint so that he could reach into their bag of tricks and depict the models in such a way that emulated that type of art and the strength of that art to make the best painting possible in the subject matter that he was portraying. And then the other great student of George Bridgman, Andrew Loomis. Andrew Loomis painted high society and fashion illustration. So there was no ruggedness in these types of paintings. As you can see within all of these examples, we don't see knobby knuckles, we don't see loose skin and craggly knuckles. Everything has a clearness and a clarity to it. And the colors he used are very clean and very light and lacking that harsh sunlight suntan of the labor-intensive person. All of these hands have a fairness to them and a certain quality that makes them very distinct and easy to read, yet very elegant and very sophisticated looking. And you can also see from one of the pages in his How to Draw Hands book, he's not pushing for a lot of the anatomical clarity. Even though there is a picture in there of the skeleton, he's pushing the elegance, refining the shapes, and breaking them down into the simplest planes possible for maximum readability, but also for that decadent feeling. And then zooming way ahead into modern times here, we have the more popular trend of anime and manga, and we can see how those fingers are designed. Most of these are Studio Ghibli, and then we also have one example from Ghost in the Shell, but it's still very similar to all the other hands that are here. They're very symbolic, very easy to read. And given that these were hand-drawn animations, the more detail you put into something, the harder it is to animate. So things have been streamlined to a certain extent for simplicity of usage in this type of art form. And when you see one of these images, it's almost immediate that you can tell that this comes from anime. Now that we've been exposed to a range and variety of cultures and of artists who depicted the hands in their own manner based upon the art form that they were doing and who they were doing it for, hopefully that gives you incentive to do the same thing when you generate the work that you're doing. Now we're going to take a look at all the inner workings of the hand, the mechanics, the construction, the anatomy, the vascular, and the different sections of the hand to thoroughly understand how to build these tools, the human tools of the hands, for our work that we create.